My name is Kieran Blackwood. I'm a former Navy SEAL turned private security guard. 3 days ago, I was protecting a tech CEO in Phoenix when the zombie outbreak began. I watched 5 million people turn into flesh-eating monsters in 72 hours. The government knew it was coming. They caused it deliberately. I have proof, and they want me dead for it. This is my story of survival and the conspiracy that almost ended humanity. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Kieran Blackwood, and what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about the Phoenix zombie outbreak. I was there from the very beginning, working as a private security specialist for one of the most powerful tech executives in Arizona. What started as a routine protection detail became a nightmare that exposed a conspiracy so massive it nearly ended humanity itself. Let me take you back to October 15th, 2024. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was doing what I'd done for the past 8 months, protecting Marcus Chen, the CEO of Nexus Technologies. Chen wasn't your typical billionaire client. This guy was paranoid beyond belief, constantly checking over his shoulder, installing new security systems every few weeks. Most of his peers thought he was losing his mind, but I respected his caution. In my line of work, paranoia keeps you alive. I'd been working private security for 6 years after leaving the Navy SEALs. 8 years of active duty had taught me how to read threats, how to protect high-value targets, and most importantly, how to stay calm when everything goes to hell. Chen's penthouse in downtown Phoenix was like a fortress. 32nd floor, reinforced glass, multiple escape routes, and enough surveillance equipment to monitor half the city. The man took his security seriously, and that's exactly why he hired me. That morning started like any other. I was monitoring the security feeds from the main control room when Chen burst in, clutching his phone like it was about to explode. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning running full blast. He'd been acting strange for weeks, but this was different. This was genuine fear. "Kieran, we need to talk," he said, his voice shaking. "I've been getting calls all morning about the water supply. Something's wrong with the city's water treatment facility." I'd heard the emergency broadcast earlier that morning. The Phoenix Water Department had issued warnings about minor contamination in the central processing plant. Nothing unusual, they said, just a precautionary measure. Residents were advised to boil their water for the next 24 hours while they fixed the problem. Standard procedure for a city of 5 million people. But Chen wasn't buying it. He pulled up news articles on his tablet, showing me reports from across the valley. Hundreds of people had called in sick to work that morning. Emergency rooms were seeing unusual numbers of patients with fever, nausea, and severe stomach cramps. The symptoms appeared within hours of consuming tap water. "This isn't a coincidence," Chen insisted. "I've been tracking this for weeks. The government's been running tests on municipal water systems across the country. They're calling it infrastructure assessment, but I know what it really is." I asked him what he meant by that. Chen was always talking about government conspiracies, corporate cover-ups, things that sounded like paranoid delusions. But he was also one of the smartest people I'd ever met, with government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His company developed software for public health infrastructure, monitoring systems that tracked everything from disease outbreaks to population demographics. "They've been testing something," he said quietly. "Something they call population management systems. I've seen the contracts, Kieran. My own company has been working on parts of it without even knowing what we were building." He showed me encrypted files on his personal computer, project names I'd never heard of, budget allocations that didn't make sense, and communication logs between government agencies and private contractors. Most of it was technical jargon I couldn't understand, but one phrase kept appearing over and over again: controlled population reduction. Chen explained that his company had been contracted to develop monitoring software for something called Project Lazarus. They were told it was a public health initiative designed to track and contain disease outbreaks before they became epidemics. The software could monitor water quality, identify contamination sources, and coordinate emergency response across multiple cities simultaneously. But that's not what they're using it for, Chen said. They're using it to track the effects of intentional contamination. They're testing biological agents on American cities, and Phoenix is just the beginning. I wanted to dismiss it as another one of his paranoid theories, but something about his demeanor told me this was different. Chen had been receiving threatening phone calls for the past 2 weeks. People calling his private number, telling him to stop asking questions about government contracts. His personal security had been breached twice in the past month, nothing stolen, but someone had been through his files. The morning continued with more emergency broadcasts. The mayor held a press conference, assuring everyone that the water contamination was minor and would be resolved within hours. Health officials appeared on local news stations, repeating the same talking points about precautionary measures and public safety. But Chen's monitoring systems were telling a different story. His company's software was connected to hospitals across the valley, tracking patient admissions in real time. The numbers were climbing exponentially. By 10 o'clock that morning, every major hospital in Phoenix was reporting overcrowding in their emergency departments. They're not reporting the real numbers, Chen said, staring at his computer screen. The software shows over 3,000 people admitted to hospitals in the past 6 hours. The news is saying it's less than 200. That's when his assistant Maya arrived for their scheduled morning meeting. I'd worked with Maya for months, and she was always professional, always punctual, always perfectly composed. But that morning she looked terrible. Her skin was pale and clammy, dark circles under her eyes, and she was shivering despite the warm October weather. Chen immediately noticed her condition and suggested she go home, but Maya insisted she was fine. Just a minor bug, she said. Nothing that couldn't wait until after their meeting about the quarterly financial reports. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts. Something about her behavior triggered every alarm bell in my head. Maya sat down at the conference table, but she couldn't stop fidgeting. Her hands were shaking, and she kept wiping sweat from her forehead. When Chen offered her water, she declined. When he offered coffee, she declined. She just sat there, staring at the table, breathing heavily. Maybe we should reschedule this meeting, I suggested. Maya clearly isn't feeling well. But Chen was stubborn. He had investors calling every hour, demanding updates on government contracts. The meeting with Maya was crucial for preparing his afternoon presentation to the board of directors. He couldn't afford any delays. Maya tried to stand up to get documents from her briefcase, but her legs gave out. She collapsed back into the chair, gasping for breath. Her skin had turned an unhealthy shade of gray, and her eyes were bloodshot. I moved closer, ready to call for medical assistance. "I'm fine," she whispered, but her voice was barely audible. "Just need a minute to catch my breath." Chen was getting nervous. He kept checking his phone, reading news updates about the water contamination. More hospitals were reporting overcrowding. The state health department had started setting up emergency triage centers in school gymnasiums and community centers. That's when Chen's phone rang again. Another unknown number. Another threatening voice on the other end. I could hear pieces of the conversation from across the room. Someone was telling Chen to stop investigating Project Lazarus, to delete the files he'd been collecting, to keep quiet about what he'd discovered. "Who is this?" Chen demanded, but the line went dead. Maya was getting worse. Her breathing became labored, and she started making strange noises deep in her throat. Not quite moaning, not quite growling, but something inhuman that made my skin crawl. I'd heard similar sounds during combat operations overseas, the sounds people make when they're dying. I called 911, but the lines were busy. Every emergency service in the city was overwhelmed with similar calls. I tried the direct line to Chen's personal physician, but got voicemail. The entire medical system was collapsing under the weight of whatever was happening across Phoenix. Maya's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her eyes rolled back, showing nothing but white. Her body convulsed violently, then went completely rigid. I checked for a pulse, found nothing. No breathing, no heartbeat, no response to stimuli. For all practical purposes, Maya was dead. Chen was panicking. He kept pacing around the room, making phone calls, trying to reach government contacts who might have answers about what was happening. But every call went to voicemail. Every government office was unreachable. Every official channel had gone silent. I started performing CPR on Maya, following the protocols I'd learned during military training. Chest compressions, rescue breathing, checking for vital signs, every few minutes. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. Her body temperature was dropping too quickly. Her skin was changing color, and there was a strange smell coming from her mouth. After 20 minutes of CPR, I had to admit, defeat. Maya was gone, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. I covered her body with a jacket and prepared to call the coroner, assuming the phone lines would eventually clear up. That's when Maya sat up and tried to bite my face off. I barely got my arm up in time to protect myself. Her teeth sank deep into my forearm, tearing through the fabric of my shirt and into the muscle underneath. The pain was incredible, like she was trying to rip the flesh from my bones. But worse than the physical pain was the realization that Maya was somehow alive, again attacking with inhuman strength and coordination. Her eyes were completely white, no iris or pupil visible. Her skin had turned a sickly gray color, and that strange smell was much stronger now, like rotting meat mixed with chemicals. She was making that growling sound again, but louder now, more aggressive. I managed to break free from her grip and shoved her away from me. She hit the wall hard enough to crack the drywall, but immediately got back up and came at me again. Her movements were different now, more animalistic, like she was hunting prey, instead of trying to communicate. Chen was screaming, backing away toward the door. Maya ignored him completely, focusing all her attention on me. I realized she was tracking me by scent, following the blood from my injured arm. Whatever had happened to her had turned her into something that hunted living flesh. I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from Chen's desk and hit Maya in the head, as hard as I could. The impact would have knocked out any normal person, but she barely flinched. She grabbed my wrist with both hands and tried to pull my arm toward her mouth. That's when my military training kicked in. I stopped fighting her like she was human and started fighting her like she was an enemy combatant. I used leverage to break her grip, spun behind her, and put her in a chokehold. But even cutting off her air supply didn't slow her down. I realized I was going to have to kill her. Using a technique I'd learned during close-quarters combat training, I snapped her neck with a quick, violent twist. Her body went limp immediately and she dropped to the floor. This time, she stayed down. Chen was in shock, staring at Maya's body in complete disbelief. I was trying to process what had just happened when the radio communication started coming through the building's security system. Police dispatchers, emergency medical services, National Guard units, all reporting similar incidents across the city. Multiple casualties at Phoenix General Hospital, patients attacking medical staff, request immediate backup. Downtown precinct. Report civilians exhibiting extreme violent behavior. Officers requesting military assistance. This is Sky Harbor Airport security. We have people attacking passengers at multiple gates, some kind of mass psychotic episode. I grabbed the first aid kit and bandaged my arm while listening to the radio chatter. Every emergency service in Phoenix was reporting the same thing. People were dying and coming back to life within minutes, attacking anyone they could reach, with their teeth and hands. Chen was finally starting to understand the scope of what was happening. This wasn't a water contamination accident. This wasn't a terrorist attack. This was exactly what he'd been warning me about for weeks. Someone had deliberately released a biological agent into the Phoenix water supply, turning millions of people into homicidal maniacs. They knew this was going to happen, Chen said quietly. The government contracts, the monitoring software, the population management systems. They've been planning this for months. I helped him access his encrypted files while monitoring the radio communications. Project Lazarus wasn't a public health initiative. It was a bioweapons program designed to test population control methods on American cities. Phoenix had been selected as the first test site because of its isolated location, limited water sources, and expendable population. The biological agent was designed to spread through municipal water supplies, causing rapid death followed by reanimation. The infected would retain basic motor functions but lose all higher brain activity, becoming mindless predators that hunted living flesh. The virus could spread through bites, creating a self-sustaining outbreak that would eliminate the majority of the population within days. But the most disturbing part was the timeline. According to Chen's files, Phoenix was just the beginning. Phase 2 of Project Lazarus would target major metropolitan areas across the country. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, dozens of cities with millions of potential victims. We have to warn people, Chen said. We have to get this information out before they activate the next phase. But even as he spoke, I could see him starting to show symptoms. Pale skin, excessive sweating, trembling hands. The bite Maya had given me was already showing signs of infection, with red streaks spreading up my arm toward my shoulder. The radio chatter was getting worse. Military units were being deployed across Phoenix, but instead of helping civilians, they were establishing containment zones. No one was allowed in or out of the city. Anyone who tried to cross the perimeter was shot on sight. Chen collapsed at his desk, his condition deteriorating rapidly. I knew what was going to happen next. I'd seen it with Maya, heard it described, in dozens of radio reports. Chen was going to die, and then he was going to come back as one of those things. "Kieran," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The safe behind the painting. Take everything. The files, the evidence, the backup drives. Someone has to expose what they've done." I wanted to help him to find some way to stop the infection, but I knew it was already too late. Chen's breathing became labored, then stopped entirely. His body went rigid, then limp. I waited, watching for any sign of movement. It didn't take long. Chen's eyes opened, completely white like Maya's had been. He sat up slowly, turning his head toward me with that same predatory focus. I had about 3 seconds to make a decision. Kill my client, the man I'd sworn to protect, or become his next victim. I chose survival. Breaking Chen's neck was harder than killing Maya, not because he was stronger, but because I knew him. I'd spent months protecting this man, learning his habits, sharing meals with him, listening to his fears about government conspiracies that turned out to be completely true. But sentiment doesn't stop a zombie attack. Chen was already reaching for me when I ended his reanimated life. I opened his safe and took everything inside. Encrypted hard drives, printed documents, backup files, financial records showing government payments to dozens of private contractors. Everything Chen had collected about Project Lazarus and the conspiracy behind it. The radio communications were painting a clear picture. Phoenix was completely overrun. 5 million people had been exposed to the biological agent through the Yao water supply. Conservative estimates suggested 90% would die and reanimate within the first 24 hours. The remaining 10% would either die from other causes or survive long enough to be eliminated by military containment operations. But I was still alive, and the infection in my arm wasn't spreading as fast as it should have been. Something about my immune system was slowing down the process, maybe even stopping it entirely. I didn't understand why, but I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. I started monitoring the building's security feeds, trying to assess the situation outside. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The streets were filled with infected people, moving in coordinated groups, hunting anyone who was still alive. They weren't just mindless zombies stumbling around randomly. They were organized predators working together to track down survivors. The government's biological weapon had worked exactly as designed. Phoenix was dying, and I was trapped in a 30-second floor penthouse with nowhere to run. That's when I intercepted a military communication that changed everything. A radio operator was giving coordinates to an extraction team, telling them to recover high-value assets from Chen's building. They knew I was here. They knew I had access to information about Project Lazarus, and they were coming to make sure I never had the chance to share it with anyone. The conspiracy was bigger than Chen had imagined. The zombie outbreak wasn't just a population control experiment. It was the opening move in a plan to eliminate anyone who might expose the truth about what the government had done, starting with me. I had 2 choices. wait for the military extraction team and hope they were coming to rescue me, or assume they were coming to eliminate me and prepare accordingly. Given everything I'd learned about Project Lazarus, the choice was obvious. I started preparing defensive positions throughout the penthouse, using furniture and equipment to create barriers and choke points. If they wanted to silence me, they were going to have to work for it. And if I was going to die, I was going to make sure the truth about Phoenix died with me. The infected were already starting to surround the building, drawn by the scent of living flesh. Military aircraft were circling overhead, but instead of providing air support, they seemed to be conducting surveillance operations. Everything was being monitored, recorded, analyzed as part of the ongoing experiment. I realized that surviving the next few hours was going to require everything I'd learned during 8 years of military service. The government had created the perfect storm of chaos and confusion, turning Phoenix into a testing ground for biological warfare, and I was about to become their next test subject. The radio crackled, with another transmission, clearer this time. Military units were moving into position around the building. Extraction teams were preparing to breach multiple floors simultaneously. Timeline for operation, 30 minutes. I checked my weapons inventory. 2 handguns, limited ammunition, improvised explosives using cleaning supplies and electronics from Chen's lab. Not much to work with against a coordinated military operation, but I'd worked with less during overseas deployments. The building's power grid was starting to fluctuate as infrastructure across the city failed. Emergency lighting was kicking in sporadically, and the elevator systems had gone offline entirely. If I was going to move to a more defensible position, it had to be now. I gathered Chen's files and started moving toward the stairwell. The infected had reached the lower floors of the building, and I could hear them testing doors and windows, looking for ways inside. It wouldn't be long before they figured out how to operate the fire exits. As I reached the stairwell door, I heard helicopters approaching from multiple directions. The extraction teams were beginning their operation, and I was about to find out whether they were coming to save me or kill me. Either way, the next phase of this nightmare was about to begin. The stairwell door slammed shut behind me just as the helicopters reached the building. I could hear their rotors cutting through the air, multiple aircraft positioning themselves around the penthouse. Through the small window in the stairwell, I caught glimpses of tactical teams rappelling down from military choppers. These weren't rescue operations. These were elimination squads. I had Chen's encrypted files in a waterproof bag slung across my shoulder, along with backup drives containing everything he'd discovered about Project Lazarus. The evidence of the government's biological weapons program was literally in my hands, and they were willing to kill me to get it back. The question was whether I could stay alive long enough to get the information to someone who could expose the truth. The building's emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the stairwell walls. As I made my way down from the 32nd floor, every few steps I could hear the infected testing doors on lower floors scratching at the metal, trying to find a way into the stairwell. The biological agent had turned them into relentless hunters, but they still retained enough problem-solving ability to systematically search for prey. I reached the 28th floor and heard voices coming from the penthouse above. Military personnel had breached Chen's apartment and were conducting a thorough search. I could make out fragments of their radio communications echoing down the stairwell. They were looking for me specifically, along with any files or computer equipment that might contain classified information. Target is not in primary location. Initiating building-wide search protocols. Negative on digital assets. Safe has been emptied. All hard drives removed from primary computer systems. Expanding search perimeter. Subject is considered armed and extremely dangerous. Armed and extremely dangerous. They weren't planning to take me alive. Whatever Chen had discovered about Project Lazarus was worth killing for, and I was the only person left who knew the full scope of the conspiracy. I continued down the stairwell, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the military teams. But as I reached the 25th floor, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Other voices in the stairwell below me. Not military communications, but civilian voices calling for help. There were other survivors in the building. I pressed my ear against the door to the 24th floor and listened carefully. Multiple voices, both male and female, speaking in hushed tones about barricading themselves in office spaces. They'd been hiding since the outbreak began, waiting for rescue that was never going to come. My tactical training told me to avoid them entirely. Additional people would slow me down, compromise my position, and reduce my chances of survival. But my protective instincts, the same ones that had driven me to become a bodyguard in the first place, wouldn't let me abandon civilians to die. I opened the door to the 24th floor and found myself in a typical office environment. Cubicles, conference rooms, break areas, all abandoned when the outbreak started. But from one of the corner offices, I could hear whispered conversations and the sound of furniture being moved to reinforce a doorway. I approached carefully, identifying myself as building security. The voices stopped immediately, and I could sense people on the other side of the door trying to decide whether to trust me. After several tense minutes, someone finally responded. "Are you really security, or are you one of those things that got in from the street?" The voice belonged to an older man, probably in his 60s based on the tremor in his speech. I explained that I was private security for Marcus Chen, that I'd been in the building when the outbreak started, and that I was trying to find a safe way out. The door opened slowly, revealing 4 people who'd been hiding in the office since early that morning. Pete, the building's maintenance supervisor, was a man in his late 50s who knew every inch of the structure. Sarah, an accountant from the 14th floor, had been trapped during a morning meeting when chaos erupted outside. Rodriguez, a security guard from the lobby, had made it upstairs when the infected breached the main entrance. And Lisa, a young receptionist, had been hiding in a supply closet until the others found her. All 4 of them looked terrified, exhausted, and desperate for someone to tell them what was happening. I gave them a brief explanation about the water contamination, the biological agent, and the reanimation of infected victims. I didn't mention Project Lazarus or the government conspiracy. They had enough to worry about without learning that their own government had deliberately caused the outbreak. Pete was the most valuable member of the group from a tactical standpoint. As maintenance supervisor, he had access to building schematics, utility tunnels, and emergency systems that could give us strategic advantages. He explained that the infected had breached the main lobby and several ground floor entrances, but the upper floors were still secure as long as we could control access to the stairwells. Rodriguez had been monitoring radio communications from his security post before retreating upstairs. Military units had established a perimeter around the entire downtown area, but they weren't letting anyone leave. Anyone who approached the checkpoints was being turned away or, in some cases, shot without warning. "They're not trying to help people," Rodriguez said quietly. "They're trying to contain something. Keep it from spreading outside the city." He was more right than he realized. Phoenix wasn't just experiencing a zombie outbreak. It was serving as a testing ground for biological warfare, and the military's job was to ensure that no evidence of the experiment ever left the containment zone. Sarah had been tracking news reports on her phone before the cellular networks went down. Emergency broadcasts were describing the situation as a terrorist attack using an unknown chemical weapon. Government officials were promising swift action to neutralize the threat and bring those responsible to justice. No mention of water contamination, biological agents, or Project Lazarus. The cover story was already in place, designed to deflect attention from the government's involvement. By the time the outbreak ended, the official narrative would blame foreign terrorists or domestic extremists. The truth about intentional population reduction would be buried along with the evidence. I established a defensive perimeter in the office space, using desks and filing cabinets to create barriers around the windows and doorways. Pete helped me identify structural weak points where the infected might try to break through. Rodriguez shared his ammunition and backup weapons, giving us enough firepower to hold our position for several hours if necessary. But even as we prepared our defenses, I could hear the military teams moving through the building above us. They were conducting a floor-by-floor search, clearing each level systematically. It would only be a matter of time before they reached our position. Lisa was monitoring the security feeds from her computer workstation, which still had limited access to the building's surveillance system. What she saw on the screens confirmed my worst fears about the infected behavior patterns. They weren't just mindless zombies wandering around randomly. They were coordinating their movements, testing different entry points, and adapting their tactics based on the obstacles they encountered. "They're learning," Lisa said quietly. "Look at this footage from the parking garage. They figured out how to operate the emergency doors. And here on the third floor, they're stacking furniture to reach higher windows." The biological agent had preserved enough cognitive function to make the infected effective hunters, but eliminated enough humanity to remove any moral restraints. They were like predatory animals with human intelligence, focused entirely on finding and consuming living flesh. Pete accessed the building's utility systems from his maintenance computer, giving us control over lighting, ventilation, and emergency protocols. We could potentially use these systems as weapons, creating distractions or barriers to slow down both the infected and the military teams hunting us. That's when I intercepted a military communication that changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. The radio operator was giving coordinates to multiple units, directing them to secure specific locations throughout Phoenix. But these weren't random buildings or strategic positions. These were all connected to Nexus Technologies and Marcus Chen's business operations. Priority targets include Nexus Technologies headquarters, secondary data storage facility, and all executive residences. Complete sterilization required for all locations. They weren't just hunting me. They were systematically destroying any evidence that could link Chen's company to Project Lazarus. Every server farm, every backup facility, every piece of infrastructure that might contain information about the government contracts was being targeted for elimination. Rodriguez was listening to the same communications through his security radio. He looked at me with growing suspicion, clearly wondering why military forces were so interested in Chen's business operations. I realized I was going to have to tell him more about what I'd discovered. I explained about Project Lazarus, the intentional contamination of the water supply, and the government's plan to test biological weapons on American cities. Rodriguez stared at me in disbelief, but the evidence was mounting around us. The coordinated nature of the outbreak, the military's containment protocols, the systematic targeting of specific locations. "You're telling me our own government did this to us?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I showed them some of the documents from Chen's files, carefully avoiding the most classified information. Financial records showing payments, from government agencies to bioweapons contractors. Communication logs discussing population management systems. Technical specifications for biological agents designed to spread through municipal water supplies. Pete was the first to accept the truth. As a city employee, he'd seen suspicious activity around the water treatment facilities for weeks. Government, contractors installing new monitoring equipment, conducting tests without explanation, restricting access to areas that had always been open to maintenance staff. "I thought they were just upgrading security systems," Pete said, "but some of the equipment didn't make sense for water treatment. It looked more like laboratory gear, stuff for handling hazardous materials." The pieces were falling into place. The government had been preparing Phoenix for months, installing monitoring systems to track the spread of their biological weapon, ensuring they could collect data on infection rates and mortality statistics. The entire city had been turned into a laboratory for testing population control methods. Lisa discovered something else disturbing on the security feeds. Military teams weren't just searching for survivors. They were placing explosive charges in key locations throughout the building. The same building that housed servers containing backup copies of Chen's research data. "They're going to destroy the whole building," Lisa said, pointing to her computer screen. "Look at these charges they're setting up. That's enough explosives to bring down the entire structure." I realized we had maybe an hour before the building became our tomb. The military wasn't planning to extract anyone alive. They were going to eliminate all witnesses and destroy all evidence, then blame the explosions on the infected or some other convenient scapegoat. Rodriguez suggested we try to reach the parking garage and escape in one of the vehicles stored there. Pete knew the service tunnels that connected to the garage, pathways that might be overlooked by both the infected and the military teams. It was dangerous, but staying in the building meant certain death. We started preparing for movement, gathering supplies and weapons for the journey through the lower levels. That's when the building's power grid began fluctuating, lights flickering, on and off as infrastructure across the city started failing. Emergency generators were kicking in sporadically, but the backup systems weren't designed to handle a citywide collapse. Sarah was monitoring news feeds on her phone, using the last bits of cellular data before the networks went completely dark. Government officials were holding press conferences, promising that the situation in Phoenix was under control and that similar attacks would be prevented in other cities. But I knew the truth from Chen's files. Phoenix wasn't the target of an attack. It was the first field test of a biological weapon that would eventually be deployed in major metropolitan areas across the country. Phase 2 of Project Lazarus was already in development with target cities identified and contamination protocols established. The infected were getting more aggressive as their numbers increased. Pete's security monitors showed them testing every possible entry point, working together to overcome obstacles, adapting their tactics based on what they learned from previous attempts. Their behavior was becoming more sophisticated by the hour. Rodriguez intercepted another military communication that sent chills down my spine. Units were reporting to command about accelerated mutation rates and behavioral adaptation beyond projected parameters. The biological weapon was evolving faster than the government scientists had anticipated. The subjects are demonstrating coordinated hunting behaviors and problem-solving capabilities that exceed original specifications, the radio operator reported, requesting guidance on containment protocols if current parameters are insufficient. The response from command was immediate and terrifying. Implement Phase 2 sterilization procedures. Complete elimination of all biological materials within the contamination zone. Phase 2 sterilization. I'd seen references to that protocol in Chen's classified files. It meant using incendiary weapons to burn out entire sections of the city, eliminating both the infected and any survivors who might serve as witnesses. The government was preparing to turn Phoenix into a crematorium. Lisa was crying quietly as she processed what she'd heard. The realization that her own government had deliberately infected her city, killed her friends and family, and was now planning to burn the evidence was too overwhelming to accept. But the evidence was all around us, impossible to deny. Pete was checking building schematics on his maintenance computer, looking for routes to the parking garage that would avoid both infected concentrations and military search patterns. The service tunnels were our best option, but they also presented unique dangers. Enclosed spaces with limited visibility, multiple potential ambush points, and no easy escape routes if we encountered problems. I made the decision to move before the building's power failed completely. Once the emergency lighting went out, we'd be fighting both the infected and the military teams in complete darkness. Our only advantage was Pete's knowledge of the building, layout, and Rodriguez's tactical training. We gathered everything we could carry: ammunition, first aid supplies, communication equipment, and Chen's encrypted files containing evidence of the conspiracy. I made sure each person understood that protecting those files was just as important as protecting our lives. Without evidence of what the government had done, the truth about Phoenix would die with us. Rodriguez took point as we moved toward the stairwell, using his security training to check for threats around each corner. Pete followed with building schematics and access cards for restricted areas. Sarah and Lisa stayed in the middle of our formation, protected but ready to move quickly if we encountered problems. As we reached the stairwell door, we could hear helicopters circling the building again. More military personnel were being deployed, probably because the initial search teams hadn't found what they were looking for. The net was tightening around us, and our window for escape was closing rapidly. Pete used his master key to access a service corridor that led to the building's mechanical levels. These areas were designed for maintenance access, with narrow walkways, exposed pipes, and limited lighting. But they also provided routes through the building that wouldn't appear on standard floor plans. We moved carefully through the mechanical corridor, listening for any sounds that might indicate infected or military presence. The building's infrastructure was failing around us, with water pipes bursting and electrical systems sparking as the power grid became increasingly unstable. That's when we heard voices coming from the main stairwell below us. Multiple people calling for help, begging someone to let them into the upper floors. More survivors who'd been hiding in lower parts of the building, trying to escape the infected hordes that had overrun the street level. Rodriguez wanted to ignore them and continued toward the parking garage. From a tactical standpoint, he was right. Additional survivors would slow us down and increase our chances of being detected, but I couldn't abandon people who were begging for help, especially when I had the skills and resources to potentially save them. I made the decision to investigate, despite Rodriguez's objections. We carefully made our way toward the voices, using Pete's knowledge of the building layout to approach from an unexpected direction. What we found changed everything about our escape plan. 6 more survivors had barricaded themselves in a storage room on the 15th floor. They'd been there since the morning, listening to radio communications and trying to understand what was happening outside. But they'd also been watching the military teams through windows, observing their movements and tactics. The most important thing they'd discovered was that the military wasn't just searching random locations. They were following a specific pattern, clearing buildings in a predetermined sequence. And according to their observations, our building was scheduled for complete sterilization in less than 2 hours. The survivors had also noticed something else significant. The military teams were using specialized equipment designed for handling biological hazards, full protective suits, air filtration systems, chemical detection devices. They weren't just worried about the infected, they were worried about exposure to whatever biological agent had caused the outbreak. This information confirmed my suspicions about the government's involvement. Regular military units responding to a terrorist attack wouldn't need that level of biological protection. But teams involved in cleaning up after a deliberate bioweapons test would require extensive safety protocols. I realized we needed to modify our escape plan. Getting to the parking garage was no longer enough. We needed to get completely out of the downtown area before the military implemented their sterilization protocols, and we needed to do it while carrying evidence that could expose the truth about Project Lazarus. Rodriguez was becoming increasingly agitated about the delays. Every minute we spent gathering information was a minute closer to complete military containment. He was right to be concerned, but the additional intelligence was crucial for planning our escape route. Pete discovered something important while checking his building maintenance records. The service tunnels connected to the city's storm drain system, which extended throughout downtown Phoenix. We could potentially use the drainage tunnels to travel underground, avoiding both infected areas and military checkpoints. But the storm drains also presented significant risks: limited visibility, potential flooding, and the possibility that infected individuals had already found their way into the tunnel system. We'd be trading one set of dangers for another. Lisa was monitoring the last available news feeds on her phone before the cellular networks went completely dark. Government officials were announcing expanded evacuation zones around Phoenix, telling residents in surrounding cities to prepare for possible relocation. The contamination was supposedly spreading beyond the original impact area. I knew this was part of the cover story. The government needed to explain why they were implementing such extensive containment protocols around Phoenix. Claiming that the contamination was spreading gave them justification for creating larger exclusion zones and preventing outside observers from getting too close to the truth. Sarah had been quietly studying Chen's financial documents while we planned our escape. She was an accountant, trained to identify patterns in complex financial data. What she discovered added another layer to the conspiracy we were uncovering. These payments from government agencies, Sarah said, pointing to specific entries in Chen's records. They're not just going to Nexus Technologies. There are similar payments to companies in 12 other cities across the country. 12 other cities. 12 other potential test sites for Project Lazarus. Phoenix wasn't just a one-time experiment. It was the beginning of a nationwide biological weapons program designed to eliminate millions of Americans under the guise of counter-terrorism operations. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Government agencies were paying private contractors in multiple cities to install monitoring equipment, modify water treatment facilities, and develop population management systems. The entire country was being prepared for systematic biological warfare against its own citizens. Rodriguez was checking his watch nervously. We'd been planning and gathering intelligence for over an hour, and he estimated we had less than 60 minutes before the building's destruction. Time was running out and we still hadn't started moving toward our escape route. I made the decision to move immediately, taking all 10 survivors with us toward the storm drain access point Pete had identified. It wasn't ideal from a tactical standpoint, but abandoning half our group would be a moral failure I couldn't accept. We were going to survive together or die together. Pete led us through a series of maintenance corridors toward the building's basement levels, using his access cards to open restricted doors along the way. The infrastructure was failing rapidly around us, with emergency lighting flickering and ventilation systems making strange noises as they struggled to function. As we reached the basement level, we could hear the infected testing doors and barriers on the floors above us. They'd found ways into the building and were systematically searching each level for survivors. Their behavior was becoming more organized and efficient, adapting to the building's layout just like human tactical teams would. But we could also hear military communications getting closer. Search teams were working their way down from the upper floors, clearing each level methodically. We were caught between two deadly forces, both hunting us for different reasons. Pete found the storm drain access point behind a locked maintenance door. The entrance was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, leading to a concrete tunnel that disappeared into darkness. It smelled terrible and echoed with the sound of dripping water, but it represented our only chance of escaping the building alive. Rodriguez went first, using a flashlight to check for immediate dangers in the tunnel. The rest of us followed one by one, squeezing through the narrow opening into the storm drain system. As the last person entered the tunnel, we could hear explosions beginning on the upper floors of the building. The military had started their sterilization protocol. Our former shelter was being systematically destroyed, along with any evidence of our presence. But we were alive, we were mobile, and we still had Chen's files containing proof of the government conspiracy. The next phase of our survival was about to begin in the darkness beneath Phoenix. The storm drain tunnel stretched into absolute darkness ahead of us, filled with the echo of our movements and the distant rumble of explosions from the building we'd just escaped. The concrete walls were slick with moisture and decades of accumulated grime, but they represented our lifeline through the chaos that Phoenix had become. Rodriguez was maintaining point position with his flashlight, carefully checking each section of tunnel before signaling us to advance. Behind him, our group of 10 survivors moved in single file, trying to balance speed with stealth. Every footstep seemed to echo endlessly in the confined space, and I worried that the sound might attract attention from whatever else might be using these tunnels. Pete was navigating using his knowledge of the city's infrastructure, but even he admitted that the storm drain system was more complex than he'd realized. Multiple levels, connecting passages, overflow channels that led to different parts of the drainage network. We could easily get lost down here, wandering in circles while the military implemented their sterilization protocols above ground. The explosions were getting more frequent and more intense. Through drainage grates above us, we could see flashes of light and clouds of smoke as entire city blocks were systematically destroyed. The government wasn't just eliminating evidence of Project Lazarus. They were erasing entire neighborhoods to ensure that no witnesses survived to tell the truth about what had happened. Sarah was struggling with the reality of what we'd discovered. As we moved through the tunnel, she kept asking questions about the conspiracy, trying to understand how her own government could deliberately kill millions of its own citizens. The financial documents she'd analyzed painted a clear picture of premeditation and coordination across multiple agencies. "Those payments to contractors in 12 other cities," Sarah whispered as we paused at a junction in the tunnel system. "If Phoenix was just the first test, how many more people are going to die before this ends?" I didn't have an answer that would provide any comfort. Chen's files suggested that Project Lazarus was designed as a nationwide population reduction program, with Phoenix serving as the proof of concept. If the experiment here was considered successful, the biological weapon would be deployed in major metropolitan areas across the country. Lisa had been monitoring her phone for any remaining cellular signal, hoping to contact family members in other cities. But the communication networks had gone completely dark, not just in Phoenix but apparently across the entire southwestern United States. The government was implementing information blackouts to prevent news of the outbreak from spreading. Rodriguez stopped suddenly and raised his hand for silence. Through the darkness ahead, we could hear voices echoing in the tunnel system. Not the growling sounds of infected individuals, but human conversation. Other survivors who'd had the same idea about using the storm drains to escape the chaos above ground. We approached carefully, weapons ready but hoping for a peaceful encounter. What we found was a group of 12 people who'd been hiding in the tunnels since the outbreak began. City workers, homeless individuals who knew the underground systems, and families who'd fled their homes when the infected overran their neighborhoods. Their leader was a man named Marcus, not to be confused with Marcus Chen, who worked for the city's water department. He'd been on duty at the treatment facility when the contamination occurred, and his first-hand account confirmed everything we'd learned from Chen's classified documents. They brought in new equipment 3 weeks ago, Marcus explained quietly. Government contractors with security clearances I'd never seen before. They installed monitoring systems, modified the chemical injection protocols, and restricted access to areas that had always been open to regular staff. Marcus had tried to report the unusual activity to his supervisors but was told that it was part of a federal security upgrade. When he persisted in asking questions, he was threatened with termination and loss of his security clearance. The message was clear: cooperate or face serious consequences. On the morning of the outbreak, Marcus had watched the contractors remotely activate systems that introduced an unknown biological agent into the water supply. He'd tried to stop the process, but the new equipment was controlled externally and wouldn't respond to local commands. Within hours, people throughout Phoenix were showing symptoms of infection. I stayed long enough to document everything I could, Marcus said, showing us photographs and notes he'd managed to take before fleeing the facility. Serial numbers on the equipment, communication logs, technical specifications for the biological agent. I knew someone would need evidence of what really happened. His documentation corroborated the information in Chen's files, providing independent verification of the government's involvement in the outbreak. Between Marcus's evidence and Chen's classified documents, we had enough proof to expose the conspiracy, if we could find a way to get the information to credible news organizations. But first, we had to survive long enough to reach safety outside the military containment zone. Marcus's group had been trying to navigate toward the city limits using the storm drain system, but they'd encountered problems. Some tunnels were flooded due to damaged infrastructure. Others had been sealed by military teams to prevent escape routes. More importantly, they'd discovered that the infected weren't just confined to the surface streets. Some had found their way into the underground systems and were hunting in the tunnels. The biological agent had enhanced their predatory instincts without eliminating their ability to adapt to new environments. Pete studied Marcus's rough maps of the tunnel system, comparing them with his building maintenance records and city infrastructure databases. Together, they identified a route that might take us beyond the downtown containment area, but it would require traveling through sections of the system that were likely to be flooded or compromised. As we planned our route, Rodriguez was monitoring military communications on his portable radio. The messages he intercepted were becoming increasingly urgent and concerning. Military commanders were reporting that the infected were exhibiting behavioral patterns that exceeded their original projections. Subjects are demonstrating coordinated hunting behaviors and tactical adaptation beyond initial parameters, one radio operator reported. Request guidance on enhanced containment protocols. The response from command was immediate and chilling. Implement Phase 2 sterilization procedures immediately. Authorization granted for expanded target zones. Phase 2. Sterilization. I'd seen references to this protocol in Chen's classified files, but hadn't fully understood the implications. Until now, it meant using incendiary weapons to burn out larger sections of the city, extending far beyond the original outbreak area. Lisa was crying again as she processed what this meant for her family and friends in surrounding neighborhoods. The government wasn't just planning to eliminate the infected and any witnesses to Project Lazarus. They were preparing to destroy entire communities to ensure complete containment of their biological weapon. I realized we had maybe 2 hours before the expanded sterilization began. After that, our chances of reaching safety would be virtually zero. The tunnels might protect us from the initial incendiary strikes, but they wouldn't save us from the systematic elimination of anyone who might have been exposed to information about the conspiracy. Marcus's group had supplies and equipment that complemented what we'd brought from the building. Water purification tablets, emergency food rations, additional flashlights and batteries. Combined with our weapons and communication gear, we had enough resources to sustain a longer journey through the tunnel system. But we also had a larger group to manage, which created new challenges for movement and security. 22 people trying to move quietly through confined spaces, coordinate their actions, and maintain operational security. The larger our group became, the more likely we were to be detected by hostile forces. Sarah had been studying the financial documents from Chen's files while we planned our route. Her accounting background allowed her to identify patterns and connections that I'd missed during my initial review. What she discovered added another disturbing dimension to the conspiracy we were uncovering. The government payments aren't just going to bioweapons contractors, Sarah explained quietly. There are also significant funds allocated to media companies, news organizations, and public relations firms. They've been paying for narrative control and information management. The cover story about terrorist attacks using chemical weapons hadn't been developed after the outbreak began. It had been planned months in advance, with specific organizations contracted to promote the false narrative and suppress any contradictory information. The government had prepared not just the biological weapon, but the entire information warfare campaign to hide their involvement. Marcus's documentation from the water treatment facility included communication logs that supported Sarah's findings. Government contractors had been coordinating with media liaisons to ensure that news coverage would focus on terrorism rather than biological weapons testing. The script for covering up Project Lazarus had been written before the first person in Phoenix became infected. Pete was becoming increasingly concerned about our route through the tunnel system. His knowledge of city infrastructure suggested that several key passages would be impassable due to flooding or structural damage from the explosions occurring above ground. We might have to surface temporarily to reach alternative routes, exposing ourselves to both infected and military forces. Rodriguez intercepted another military communication that changed our understanding of the tactical situation. Special operations teams were being deployed specifically to hunt for survivors who might have obtained classified information about Project Lazarus. They weren't just implementing containment protocols, they were conducting targeted elimination missions. Priority targets include any individuals with government connections, technical knowledge, or access to classified materials, the radio operator reported. Rules of engagement authorize immediate elimination of potential intelligence threats. I realized that my background as a former Navy SEAL and private security contractor made me a specific target for these elimination teams. The government knew that someone with my training and security clearance would be capable of understanding and exposing their biological weapons program. They couldn't afford to let me escape with Chen's classified documents. Lisa discovered something disturbing while checking the last available news feeds on her phone before the cellular networks went completely dark. Reports were emerging from other cities about unusual activity around water treatment facilities, government contractors conducting security upgrades, restricted access to previously public areas, and increased federal oversight of municipal water systems. The pattern was identical to what Marcus had observed in Phoenix. Other cities were being prepared for Phase 2 of Project Lazarus, with infrastructure modifications that would allow biological agents to be introduced into their water supplies. The nationwide deployment was already underway. As we moved deeper into the tunnel system, we started encountering evidence that infected individuals had been using these passages. Scratch marks on the concrete walls, bloodstains on the floor, and the unmistakable smell of decay that accompanied the reanimated corpses. They were adapting to underground environments just as effectively as they'd adapted to urban hunting. Marcus's group had developed techniques for avoiding infected encounters in the tunnels, moving in absolute silence, using minimal lighting, and following routes that avoided areas where the creatures might congregate. But with 22 people in our combined group, maintaining that level of stealth was becoming increasingly difficult. We reached a major junction in the tunnel system where multiple drainage channels converged. Pete's map suggested this area would give us access to several different routes toward the city limits, but it also represented a choke point where we might encounter other groups trying to escape through the underground system. Rodriguez was scouting ahead when he encountered something that forced us to completely reconsider our escape plan. Military teams had anticipated that survivors would use the storm drains to evade containment, and they'd positioned monitoring equipment at key locations throughout the tunnel system. Motion sensors, thermal imaging devices, and acoustic detection equipment were being used to track movement in the underground passages. Our presence had likely been detected already, and special operations teams were probably being deployed to intercept us before we could reach the city limits. The realization that we were being actively hunted by both infected predators and military elimination teams created a tactical nightmare. We couldn't move quickly enough to avoid the infected without triggering the military's detection systems. But we couldn't move slowly enough to avoid detection without being overtaken by the biological predators hunting us. Marcus suggested splitting our group into smaller units that could take different routes through the tunnel system. It would reduce our collective visibility and increase the chances that at least some of us would survive to expose the truth about Project Lazarus. But it also meant abandoning the protection that came from larger numbers and concentrated firepower. I was reluctant to divide our group, especially given my protective instincts and responsibility for the classified documents we were carrying, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional escape strategies weren't working against the combination of threats we faced. Sarah had been monitoring government communications on Rodriguez's radio while we debated our options. What she heard convinced me that splitting up might be our only chance of survival. Military commanders were coordinating a systematic sweep of the entire underground system, using multiple teams to cover all possible escape routes. "They know we're down here," Sarah said quietly, "and they know we have information they can't afford to let out. This isn't about containment anymore, this is about eliminating witnesses." I made the decision to divide our group into 3 units, each taking a different route toward the city limits. Marcus would lead one group using his knowledge of the water department infrastructure. Pete would lead another group using his building maintenance expertise. I would take the remaining group, including Rodriguez and the classified documents, using the most direct route despite the increased risks. Before we separated, I made copies of the most critical documents from Chen's files, distributing them among the 3 groups to ensure that evidence of the conspiracy would survive, even if some of us didn't make it to safety. Each group leader received financial records, technical specifications, and communication logs that proved government involvement in Project Lazarus. Marcus's group included several city workers who understood municipal infrastructure and could potentially reach media contacts outside the containment zone. Pete's group included survivors with technical backgrounds who could analyze and verify the evidence we'd collected. My group included the people with the most combat training and the best chances of fighting through military checkpoints. As we prepared to separate, Lisa made a discovery that added urgency to our escape timeline. Her phone had briefly reconnected to a cellular network, probably from a tower outside the primary containment zone. The news reports she accessed revealed that government officials were preparing to expand the Phoenix containment area significantly. "They're evacuating surrounding cities," Lisa reported. "Scottsdale, Tempe, Glendale, all residents are being relocated to temporary camps while authorities assess the contamination spread." I knew this was cover for expanding the sterilization zone. The government needed to clear civilian populations from larger areas to implement more extensive destruction protocols. Anyone remaining in the expanded zone would be eliminated along with the evidence of Project Lazarus. Rodriguez was checking his ammunition and equipment for the journey ahead. As a security professional, he understood the tactical realities we faced better than the civilian members of our group. The chances of reaching safety were minimal, but the alternative was certain death in the underground tunnels. "How many special operations teams do you think they've deployed for this?" Rodriguez asked quietly. Based on the military communications we'd intercepted, I estimated at least 50 personnel dedicated specifically to hunting survivors with potential intelligence value. Combined with regular containment forces and automated detection systems, we were facing overwhelming opposition with limited resources and no backup support. Pete was making final adjustments to our route planning, identifying alternative passages, and backup routes in case our primary path was compromised. His knowledge of city infrastructure was invaluable, but even he admitted that much of the tunnel system was unmapped territory that we'd have to navigate through trial and error. Sarah was securing copies of the financial documents in waterproof containers, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if we encountered flooding or other environmental hazards in the tunnels. Her analysis of the conspiracy's financial structure provided crucial context for understanding how Project Lazarus had been funded and coordinated. Marcus was briefing his group on water department protocols and emergency procedures that might be useful during their escape attempt. His first-hand knowledge of how the biological agent had been introduced into Phoenix's water supply made him a primary target for government elimination teams. As we prepared to move toward our separate routes, I realized that this might be the last time our group would be together. Some of us might make it to safety and survive to expose the truth about Project Lazarus. Others would probably die in the tunnels, either killed by infected predators or eliminated by military teams. But regardless of individual survival, we'd documented evidence of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The truth about the deliberate biological weapons attack on Phoenix would eventually be exposed, even if none of us lived to see it happen. Rodriguez took point as my group began moving toward our assigned route. Behind him I carried the original classified documents from Chen's safe, along with Marcus's photographic evidence from the water treatment facility. The remaining survivors in my group included Lisa, who understood the technical aspects of the monitoring systems we'd discovered, and 3 others with various skills that might prove useful. As we moved deeper into the tunnel system, we could hear the other groups taking their separate paths through different sections of the underground network. The sound of footsteps and whispered communications gradually faded as the distance between us increased, leaving each group to face the dangers ahead with only their own resources and determination. The tunnel ahead curved toward what Pete's maps indicated was the edge of the downtown containment zone. If we could reach that area without being detected or eliminated, we might have a chance of contacting outside authorities who could investigate the conspiracy we'd uncovered. But first, we had to survive the next few hours in the darkness beneath a city that was being systematically destroyed to hide the truth about Project Lazarus. The military's detection systems were tracking our movements, special operations teams were hunting us specifically, and infected predators were adapting their behavior to hunt more effectively in underground environments. The odds against survival were overwhelming, but the stakes were too high to surrender. Millions of lives depended on exposing the truth about the government's biological weapons program before Phase 2 could be implemented in other cities across the country. Rodriguez signaled for us to stop as we approached another junction in the tunnel system. Through the darkness ahead, we could see artificial lighting that didn't belong in the storm drain infrastructure. Military teams had established monitoring stations at key choke points, exactly as we'd feared. The next phase of our escape would require getting past professional soldiers with advanced detection equipment while carrying evidence that they were under orders to eliminate at any cost. Our survival had just become significantly more complicated. The artificial lighting ahead of us cast harsh shadows on the tunnel walls, revealing the silhouettes of military personnel positioned at what should have been a routine drainage junction. Rodriguez counted at least 6 soldiers with advanced detection equipment, thermal imaging devices, and communication gear that connected them directly to command headquarters. They weren't just monitoring the tunnels. They were actively hunting for specific targets. I signaled for our group to retreat into a side passage while I assessed the tactical situation. The military checkpoint was positioned perfectly to intercept anyone trying to reach the edge of the containment zone through this section of the storm drain system. But their positioning also revealed something crucial about their operational parameters. They were focused on preventing escape rather than conducting aggressive patrols, which meant there might be alternative routes they weren't covering as thoroughly. Lisa was monitoring the soldiers through a small drainage grate that provided visual access to their position. Their equipment included biological detection devices, the same type of hazmat gear we'd seen military teams using throughout the outbreak. But they were also carrying specialized weapons designed for close quarters, combat in confined spaces. These weren't regular containment forces. They were elimination specialists. Rodriguez was studying the tunnel layout using Pete's maps, looking for alternative routes that might bypass the military checkpoint. The storm drain system was more complex than we'd initially realized, with multiple levels and connecting passages that weren't marked on standard city infrastructure plans. Some of these unmarked tunnels might provide access to areas beyond the military's monitoring perimeter. As we planned our route around the checkpoint, I intercepted a radio communication that changed everything about our tactical situation. The soldiers at the junction weren't just blocking our escape route. They were part of a coordinated sweep operation designed to drive survivors toward predetermined elimination zones. Herding operation is proceeding according to schedule, the radio operator reported. Civilian targets are being channeled toward designated termination areas. Estimated completion time for Phase 2 sterilization is 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The military had been using the tunnel monitoring stations to guide survivors towards specific locations where they could be eliminated more efficiently. Instead of hunting us individually throughout the underground system, they were manipulating our movement patterns to concentrate targets in areas that could be destroyed with minimal effort. I realized that our escape plan had been compromised from the beginning. The routes we'd chosen based on Pete's infrastructure knowledge were exactly the paths the military expected us to take. They'd been herding us like livestock toward slaughter, using our own tactical thinking against us. Lisa was becoming increasingly agitated as she processed the implications of what we'd discovered. Her family lived in one of the neighborhoods that would be included in the expanded sterilization zone. The military wasn't just eliminating witnesses to Project Lazarus. They were destroying entire communities to ensure complete operational security. Rodriguez suggested we reverse direction and try to reach one of the other groups, but I knew that option would only delay the inevitable. Marcus and Pete's groups were probably being herded toward their own elimination zones using the same tactics. The military had anticipated that survivors would split up and had prepared countermeasures for multiple escape attempts. The only option that might work was something the military wasn't expecting. Instead of trying to escape through the tunnel system, we needed to surface in an area they considered already secured and try to reach the containment perimeter from an unexpected direction. It was extremely dangerous, but it was also our only chance of avoiding the elimination zones they'd prepared. I made the decision to abandon the storm drain route and return to the surface, despite the obvious risks of encountering infected individuals and military patrols. We had Chen's classified documents and Marcus's photographic evidence, which meant we were carrying the most comprehensive proof of the government conspiracy. Getting that evidence to safety was worth taking exceptional risks. Rodriguez was reluctant to leave the relative security of the tunnel system, but he understood the tactical logic behind my decision. The military's herding operation was designed to exploit predictable escape routes. By doing something unpredictable, we might catch them off guard and create opportunities they hadn't planned for. Lisa was terrified at the prospect of returning to street level, where infected individuals were still hunting for survivors. But she also understood that staying in the tunnels meant certain death in one of the military's elimination zones. Sometimes the most dangerous option is actually the safest choice when all conventional alternatives have been compromised. We gathered our equipment and prepared to surface through a drainage access point that Pete's maps indicated would bring us up in an industrial area several blocks from our previous location. The area had been heavily damaged by the military's initial sterilization strikes, which might provide cover for our movement, while also reducing the likelihood of encountering large groups of infected. Rodriguez went first, carefully checking the street level for immediate threats before signaling the rest of us to follow. What we found was a landscape of destruction that exceeded anything I'd seen during overseas combat operations. Entire city blocks had been reduced to smoking rubble by incendiary weapons, creating an apocalyptic wasteland that bore no resemblance to the Phoenix we'd known. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning chemicals, making it difficult to breathe and limiting our visibility to perhaps 50 yards in any direction. But the destruction also provided concealment from military surveillance systems. and created obstacles that would slow down any pursuit forces if we were detected. Lisa was struggling with the environmental conditions, coughing repeatedly and having difficulty maintaining the pace we needed to reach the containment perimeter before the next phase of sterilization began. The smoke wasn't just from burning buildings. It contained chemical residues from the biological weapons that had been used to eliminate infected individuals and destroy evidence of Project Lazarus. As we moved through the devastated industrial area, we started encountering bodies that showed signs of exposure to military-grade incendiary weapons. But some of the corpses weren't infected individuals killed during containment operations. They were civilians who'd been eliminated because they were in the wrong place when the sterilization protocols were implemented. Rodriguez discovered something that confirmed our worst fears about the military's rules of engagement: shell casings from weapons that had been used to execute survivors rather than infected individuals. The elimination teams weren't just hunting people with classified information. They were killing anyone who might serve as a witness to what had happened in Phoenix. The scope of the atrocity was staggering. The government hadn't just tested a biological weapon on an American city. They'd implemented systematic genocide to cover up their involvement, murdering thousands of innocent civilians to protect their conspiracy. The evidence we were carrying documented the largest domestic terrorism operation in United States history. Lisa found something while searching through the rubble of a destroyed office building: personal computers and communication equipment that had been specifically targeted for destruction, suggesting that the military was eliminating not just people but any technology that might contain information about Project Lazarus. The cover-up operation was more thorough than we'd imagined. As we continued toward the containment perimeter, we encountered more evidence of the systematic elimination campaign: vehicles that had been destroyed while trying to flee the city, roadblocks where civilians had been executed rather than evacuated, and communication towers that had been demolished to prevent outside contact. Rodriguez was monitoring military communications while we moved, trying to track the locations of patrol units and elimination teams. What he heard painted a clear picture of the operational timeline. Phase 2. Sterilization was proceeding on schedule, with expanded target zones being cleared systematically to eliminate all potential witnesses. Sector 7 cleared for final sterilization. No survivors detected. Proceeding to Sector 8. Elimination Team Alpha reports successful termination of 23 civilian targets in Industrial Zone. Phase 2 timeline confirmed. Complete operational security achieved in primary target areas. I realized we had perhaps 20 minutes before the industrial area we were crossing would be targeted for final sterilization. The military was conducting a methodical sweep of the entire downtown region, eliminating survivors and destroying evidence in a predetermined sequence that would culminate in the complete obliteration of any trace of Project Lazarus. Lisa was breaking down emotionally as she processed the scale of what the government had done to her city. The realization that her friends, family, and neighbors had been deliberately murdered by their own government was overwhelming. But I needed her to maintain focus for just a few more minutes while we reached the containment perimeter. Rodriguez spotted military vehicles approaching our position from multiple directions. The elimination teams had detected our presence and were converging on our location using coordinated search patterns. We had maybe 5 minutes before they reached us, and very limited options for concealment in the devastated landscape. I made the decision to use the classified documents as a bargaining chip if we were captured. The military's primary objective was preventing information about Project Lazarus from reaching outside observers. If I could convince them that the documents were secured in a location they couldn't access without my cooperation, it might buy us time to escape or at least ensure that someone else could recover the evidence. But as the military vehicles drew closer, I realized that negotiation wasn't going to be an option. These weren't regular soldiers following rules of engagement. They were elimination specialists operating under orders to kill anyone with potential knowledge of the conspiracy. They would torture me for information about the documents, then execute our entire group regardless of cooperation. Rodriguez was preparing for a firefight using what little ammunition we had remaining. Lisa was looking for concealment among the rubble of destroyed buildings. But I knew that conventional tactical responses weren't going to work against the overwhelming firepower approaching our position. That's when I remembered something from Chen's classified files about Project Lazarus. The biological weapon wasn't designed just to create zombies. It was designed to be controllable, with specific activation and deactivation protocols that could be used to start and stop outbreaks as needed. The government had built safeguards into their bioweapon to protect their own personnel. The military, teams hunting us were carrying biological detection equipment, not just to monitor contamination levels but to ensure they didn't accidentally trigger secondary infections. They were vulnerable to the same biological agent they'd used to attack Phoenix, which meant they had to maintain strict safety protocols that might create tactical opportunities. I started moving toward the approaching vehicles instead of away from them, using a strategy that would force them to choose between maintaining biological safety and pursuing their elimination mission. If I could get close enough to threaten their protective equipment, they might hesitate long enough for us to escape or find better defensive positions. Rodriguez thought I'd lost my mind, but he followed my lead as we advanced toward the military checkpoint instead of retreating. Lisa stayed hidden among the rubble, carrying backup copies of the classified documents in case our tactical gamble failed completely. The military vehicles stopped just short of our position, and elimination team members deployed with their weapons trained on us. But they maintained distance and didn't advance aggressively, confirming my theory about their biological safety protocols. They were afraid of exposure to their own weapon. "Drop your weapons and surrender the classified materials," the team leader called out through a loudspeaker. "You have 30 seconds to comply before we implement terminal protocols." I knew that surrendering would mean immediate execution for our entire group, but I also knew that they were operating under strict contamination guidelines that limited their tactical options. Instead of surrendering, I started moving closer to their position while holding up one of Chen's encrypted hard drives. "This contains everything about Project Lazarus," I called back. "Technical specifications, financial records, communication, logs, and evidence of government involvement in biological weapons testing. If you kill me, you'll never find the backup copies I've hidden throughout the city." The elimination team leader was communicating with his command structure through encrypted radio channels, requesting guidance on how to proceed. The documents I was carrying contained information that could expose the conspiracy at the highest levels of government. They needed to recover the evidence, but they also couldn't afford to let us escape with it. Rodriguez was positioning himself to provide covering fire if the negotiation failed, but he was also ready to follow my lead if an opportunity for escape presented itself. Lisa was documenting everything from her concealed position, using her phone to record the encounter with the elimination team. The military's response revealed just how valuable our evidence was to their operational security. Instead of implementing immediate terminal protocols, they were calling in additional resources to handle the situation. Specialized interrogation teams, technical specialists who could analyze the encrypted data, and command personnel who understood the full scope of Project Lazarus. "You have information that belongs to the United States government," the team leader announced. "Surrender that information immediately and you'll be processed through standard detention protocols." I knew that standard detention protocols meant execution after interrogation, but the fact that they were offering any alternative suggested that recovering the classified documents was their primary objective. They needed to know what evidence we had and where we might have hidden additional copies before they could safely eliminate us. Lisa was using her phone to broadcast our location and situation to any outside observers who might still have internet access beyond the containment zone. If we were going to be captured or killed, at least there would be a record of what had happened to us and why the government considered us such a threat. Rodriguez was studying the elimination team's positioning and equipment, looking for tactical weaknesses we might exploit. They were maintaining biological safety distances, which meant they couldn't use close-quarters combat techniques effectively. Their protective gear also limited their mobility and field of vision. I started walking slowly toward the military vehicles, maintaining eye contact with the team leader while keeping the encrypted hard drive visible in my hands. My military training had taught me how to read people under stress, and I could see that he was genuinely concerned about the information I was carrying. Project Lazarus wasn't just about Phoenix, I called out as I approached. Your own government has been planning similar attacks on 12 other American cities. The people you're working for are planning to kill millions of innocent civilians using biological weapons. The team leader's response confirmed that he didn't know the full scope of what he was helping to cover up. Like most military personnel, he'd been told he was protecting national security without being given details about the operations he was supporting. The revelation that Project Lazarus involved attacking American cities was clearly disturbing to him. Rodriguez was moving to flank the military position, while I maintained their attention with the negotiation. Lisa was still recording from her concealed location, capturing evidence of the government's elimination operations that could be used to expose the conspiracy if any of us survived. But as I got closer to the military vehicles, I realized that the team leader was receiving new orders through his communication system. Someone at command level had made a decision about how to handle our situation, and the change in his posture suggested that the decision wasn't favorable to our survival. New orders received, the team leader announced. Terminal protocols authorized regardless of intelligence recovery. You have 10 seconds to drop the encrypted device and assume surrender positions. I knew that surrendering would mean immediate execution, but I also realized that our tactical situation had become hopeless. The military had decided that eliminating witnesses was more important than recovering evidence, which meant they were confident that any backup copies we'd hidden could be found and destroyed through other means. Rodriguez opened fire on the elimination team, using his superior knowledge of urban combat to exploit weaknesses in their defensive positioning. But we were facing overwhelming odds with limited ammunition and no backup support. The firefight could only delay the inevitable. Lisa abandoned her concealed position and started running toward what she hoped was a gap in the military perimeter. She was carrying backup copies of the most critical documents, including financial records that proved government funding for Project Lazarus, and technical specifications that detailed how the biological weapon had been deployed. I used the confusion created by Rodriguez's covering fire to reach one of the military vehicles and plant an improvised explosive device using equipment from Chen's laboratory. The explosion would destroy their communication equipment and create enough chaos for Lisa to reach the containment perimeter. But as I prepared to detonate the device, I was hit by sniper fire from an elimination team member positioned on a nearby rooftop. The impact knocked me to the ground and I could feel blood spreading across my chest. Rodriguez was pinned down by automatic weapons fire and couldn't reach my position. Lisa was still running toward the perimeter, but military vehicles were converging on her location from multiple directions. She had perhaps 30 seconds before being captured or killed, and she was carrying the only remaining evidence that could expose the truth about Project Lazarus. I triggered the explosive device as my consciousness started fading from blood loss. The blast destroyed the military vehicle and created enough confusion for Rodriguez to break contact and pursue Lisa. But I knew I wouldn't survive long enough to see whether they reached safety. As I lay on the ground bleeding out, I could hear radio communications confirming that Phase 2 sterilization was beginning in our sector. Incendiary weapons were being deployed to eliminate all remaining evidence of Project Lazarus, including any witnesses who might have survived the elimination operations. The last thing I remember was the sound of aircraft approaching with their payload of destruction, preparing to erase the final traces of the government's biological weapons experiment. But somewhere in the chaos, Lisa was still running with evidence that could expose the conspiracy to the world. Rodriguez was still fighting, still protecting civilians, still carrying out the mission that had brought us together in the first place. The truth about Project Lazarus would survive, even if we didn't. The flames were spreading across the industrial zone, as incendiary weapons turned everything into an inferno designed to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. But the most important evidence was still moving toward the containment perimeter, carried by a young woman who understood that millions of lives depended on exposing the truth. That's when I lost consciousness, not knowing whether our sacrifice would be enough to stop the government from implementing Phase 2 of their biological weapons program in other American cities. I woke up in what I initially thought was a government detention facility, but the voices around me were speaking with accents that definitely weren't American. My chest was bandaged professionally, and I was connected to medical equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything the military elimination teams would have bothered providing for a prisoner they intended to execute. The room gradually came into focus, revealing that I was in some kind of medical facility, with personnel wearing uniforms I didn't recognize. International humanitarian, markings, United Nations insignia, and equipment that suggested this was a legitimate rescue operation rather than a government cover-up facility. Someone had found me after the explosion and provided actual medical care. A woman approached my bed, introducing herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus Chen, working with an international medical team that had been monitoring the Phoenix situation from outside the containment zone. She explained that they'd recovered me from the industrial area after intercepting Lisa's broadcast about our encounter with the elimination team. Your friend Rodriguez managed to get the young woman to our checkpoint, Dr. Chen explained. She had encrypted hard drives and documents that provided the first independent verification of what really happened in Phoenix. The international community has been investigating biological weapons violations, and your evidence confirmed our worst suspicions. Lisa had survived. Rodriguez had completed the mission. The classified documents from Marcus Chen's files and the photographic evidence from the water treatment facility had reached credible authorities who could investigate the conspiracy. Everything we'd sacrificed during those 72 hours hadn't been in vain. Dr. Chen showed me news reports from international media organizations that had broken the story about Project Lazarus within hours of receiving our evidence. The financial records Sarah had analyzed, the technical specifications we'd recovered, and Marcus's documentation from the water treatment facility had provided irrefutable proof of government involvement in biological weapons testing on American civilians. The international response had been immediate and comprehensive. The United Nations Security Council had convened emergency sessions. NATO allies had suspended intelligence cooperation with the United States. International criminal courts had issued arrest warrants for government officials connected to Project Lazarus. The conspiracy we'd uncovered was being exposed on a global scale. But the American government's response had been predictable. They were claiming that the documents were fabricated, that the outbreak was caused by terrorists, and that any evidence suggesting government involvement was part of a foreign disinformation campaign. The same narrative control systems that Sarah had identified in Chen's financial records were being deployed to discredit our evidence. Dr. Chen explained that international investigators had been trying to access Phoenix to conduct independent verification of our claims, but the American military was maintaining the containment zone and refusing to allow outside observers. The systematic destruction of evidence was continuing even after the biological threat had been eliminated. The incendiary weapons destroyed most of the physical evidence, Dr. Chen said. But the international community has satellite imagery showing the deliberate targeting of infrastructure that should have been preserved for investigation. The pattern of destruction confirms that this was a cover-up operation rather than a public health response. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his arm in a sling but otherwise intact. He'd been providing detailed testimony to international investigators about everything we'd witnessed during the outbreak. His security background and first-hand observations of military operations had provided crucial context for understanding the scope of the conspiracy. Lisa is safe, Rodriguez reported. She's been working with computer specialists to decrypt additional files from Chen's hard drives. We recovered more information than we initially realized, including communication logs that connect Project Lazarus to similar programs in other countries. The conspiracy was international in scope, involving government agencies and private contractors across multiple nations. The biological weapons program wasn't just about American population control. It was part of a coordinated effort by global elites to reduce worldwide population levels using systematic biological warfare disguised as responses to terrorist attacks or natural disasters. Lisa joined us in the medical facility, carrying a tablet computer that displayed decrypted files from Chen's encrypted storage systems. Her technical background had proven invaluable for recovering information that government specialists might have been able to destroy if they'd had more time to analyze what we'd taken from Chen's safe. We found communication logs between American officials and counterparts in 11 other countries, Lisa explained. They're coordinating similar biological weapons programs with target cities identified in Europe, Asia, and South America. Phoenix was just the first field test of a global population reduction initiative. The scope of what we'd uncovered was staggering. Government agencies in multiple countries were planning to use biological weapons against their own civilian populations, coordinating their efforts to ensure that the attacks would appear to be isolated terrorist incidents rather than systematic warfare. Millions of people were targeted for elimination under the guise of counterterrorism operations. Dr. Chen showed me intelligence reports that international agencies had compiled using our evidence as a foundation for broader investigations. Financial networks connecting bioweapons contractors across multiple countries. Technical specifications for biological agents being developed simultaneously in different laboratories, and communication protocols that allowed coordination between government agencies that were supposedly operating independently. The pattern we'd identified in Phoenix was being replicated in target cities throughout the world. Water treatment facilities were being modified with monitoring equipment and injection systems. Municipal infrastructure was being prepared for biological agent deployment. Population management systems were being tested and refined for maximum effectiveness. Rodriguez had been working with international security agencies to identify other survivors from Phoenix who might have additional evidence about Project Lazarus. Marcus and Pete had been recovered from different sections of the tunnel system, both carrying documentation that corroborated our findings. Sarah from our original group had survived the elimination operations and was providing financial analysis that traced the funding sources for the biological weapons program. The accountant's work has been especially valuable, Rodriguez explained. She identified shell companies and financial networks that connect government agencies with private contractors in dozens of countries. The money trail proves that this conspiracy involves the highest levels of international government and corporate leadership. Lisa had also recovered communication logs that revealed the timeline for Phase 2 implementation. Other target cities had been scheduled for biological weapons deployment within 6 months of the Phoenix test, with coordination protocols established to ensure that multiple attacks would occur simultaneously to prevent international intervention. They were planning to hit 12 major metropolitan areas in a single coordinated strike, Lisa said quietly. New York, London, Tokyo, Berlin, all on the same day. The goal was to eliminate roughly 50 million people in the initial attack, with follow-up operations targeting additional cities based on the effectiveness of the biological agents. The international response to this intelligence had been unprecedented. Military forces from multiple countries were conducting raids on suspected bioweapons facilities. Government officials connected to the conspiracy were being arrested on charges of crimes against humanity. International organizations were implementing emergency protocols to protect municipal water supplies from biological weapons attacks. But the American government was doubling down on their cover story, claiming that the international response was part of a coordinated attack on American sovereignty. They were using the same narrative control techniques we'd documented in Chen's files, promoting false information through media organizations that had been contracted to support the conspiracy. Dr. Chen explained that international investigators had found evidence of similar biological weapons programs being developed in at least 15 countries, all coordinated through the same financial networks and technical protocols we'd discovered in Phoenix. The conspiracy involved government agencies, private contractors, and international organizations that had been planning systematic population reduction for several years. The Phoenix outbreak was accelerated because of Marcus Chen's investigation, Dr. Chen said. They knew he was getting close to exposing the program, so they moved up their timeline and used his company's monitoring systems to track the effectiveness of the biological weapon. Your survival and escape with the evidence was the one thing they hadn't planned for. Rodriguez was monitoring American government communications that revealed the extent of their panic about the international investigation. Officials connected to Project Lazarus were being recalled from overseas assignments. Financial accounts linked to bioweapons contractors were being frozen by international banking authorities. The conspiracy was unraveling faster than they could implement damage control. Lisa had been working with international cybersecurity experts to trace communication networks that connected bioweapons programs across multiple countries. What they'd discovered revealed that the conspiracy involved not just government agencies but international corporations and non-governmental organizations that had been coordinating population reduction efforts for decades. They call it the Sustainability Protocol, Lisa explained. The idea is that global population levels are unsustainable and need to be reduced by 90% over the next decade. They've been developing biological weapons, economic warfare, and social engineering programs designed to eliminate what they consider excess population while maintaining control over remaining survivors. The Sustainability Protocol wasn't just about biological weapons. It included plans for economic collapse, resource manipulation, and information warfare designed to create conditions that would reduce global population through seemingly natural causes. The Phoenix outbreak was just one component of a comprehensive program for systematic human elimination. Dr. Chen showed me documentation that international investigators had recovered from raided facilities in other countries. Technical specifications for biological agents that were more sophisticated than what had been used in Phoenix. Financial records showing funding for population reduction programs totaling hundreds of billions of dollars. Communication logs revealing coordination between government officials and corporate executives across multiple continents. The evidence we'd recovered from Phoenix had provided the foundation for exposing the largest criminal conspiracy in human history. But the investigation was also revealing that the conspiracy was more advanced than we'd initially realized. Some components of the Sustainability Protocol had already been implemented in regions where population reduction could be disguised as natural disasters or economic problems. Rodriguez had been debriefed by international security agencies about his observations of military operations during the Phoenix outbreak. His testimony provided crucial evidence about the systematic elimination of witnesses and the deliberate destruction of evidence. The military's rules of engagement had clearly violated international law and demonstrated premeditated genocide. They're using the same protocols in other countries, Rodriguez reported. International investigators have found evidence of similar elimination operations in at least 6 other nations where biological weapons testing has occurred. The pattern is identical to what we witnessed in Phoenix. Lisa had discovered something in Chen's files that revealed why I'd survived the biological weapon when most other people had died and reanimated. The bioweapon had been designed with genetic targeting protocols that made certain population groups more susceptible to infection, while providing relative immunity to others. The biological agent was engineered to target specific genetic markers, Lisa explained. People with certain ethnic backgrounds or genetic characteristics were more likely to die and reanimate, while others had natural resistance or immunity. It was designed as a selective population reduction tool rather than a general bioweapon. This revelation added another layer of horror to the conspiracy we'd uncovered. The biological weapon wasn't just intended to reduce population levels. It was designed to eliminate specific ethnic and genetic groups while preserving others. The Sustainability Protocol was actually a systematic eugenics program disguised as counterterrorism operations. Dr. Chen provided me with medical analysis of the biological agent that had been used in Phoenix. International laboratories had analyzed samples recovered from the outbreak area and confirmed that the bioweapon was far more sophisticated than naturally occurring pathogens. It had been engineered specifically for population control purposes with safeguards that protected certain genetic groups. The international investigation was revealing connections between the Sustainability Protocol and historical eugenics programs that had been developed during the 20th century. Many of the same organizations and family networks involved in previous genocide operations were connected to the current biological weapons conspiracy. Rodriguez was working with international law enforcement agencies to identify other survivors from similar operations in different countries. Patterns of biological weapons testing, systematic elimination of witnesses, and cover-up operations that matched what we'd experienced in Phoenix. The conspiracy was global in scope and had been operational for several years. They've been testing different biological agents in different regions, Rodriguez explained. What happened in Phoenix was just the most recent field test. They've been refining their weapons and tactics based on results from previous operations in Africa, Asia, and South America. Lisa had found communication logs that revealed the next phase of the sustainability protocol. With the Phoenix test compromised by our survival and exposure of the evidence, the conspirators were accelerating their timeline for implementing biological weapons attacks in other target cities. They were trying to complete their population reduction program before international intervention could stop them. They're planning to activate 12 facilities simultaneously within the next 2 weeks, Lisa said urgently. London, Berlin, Tokyo, Sydney, and 8 other major cities. The goal is to deploy biological weapons before the international investigation can shut down their operations. Dr. Chen immediately began coordinating with international security agencies to prevent the planned attacks. Military forces from multiple countries were being deployed to secure suspected bioweapons facilities. Government officials connected to the conspiracy were being arrested to prevent them from authorizing the attacks. The international community was implementing emergency protocols to protect target cities. But the conspirators were also implementing contingency plans that we hadn't anticipated. Instead of using municipal water supplies for biological agent deployment, they were switching to atmospheric dispersal systems that could release bioweapons through ventilation systems in office, buildings, shopping centers, and transportation hubs. Rodriguez was working with international security experts to develop countermeasures for the new deployment methods. His military background and first-hand experience with the biological weapons made him valuable for understanding how the attacks might be conducted and how they could be prevented. Lisa was analyzing communication networks to track the real-time coordination between conspirators in different countries. The international investigation had disrupted their original plans, but they were adapting their tactics and accelerating their timeline to complete as many attacks as possible before being completely shut down. They're using emergency protocols that bypass normal government oversight, Lisa reported. Officials involved in the conspiracy are activating biological weapon systems without authorization from their own governments. They're going rogue to complete the sustainability protocol, even if it exposes the entire conspiracy. The situation was becoming a race between international intervention forces trying to prevent the attacks and conspirators trying to deploy biological weapons before being stopped. The evidence we'd recovered from Phoenix had exposed the conspiracy, but it had also forced the perpetrators to accelerate their timeline and take desperate action. Dr. Chen was coordinating medical response teams that could provide treatment for biological weapons exposure if any of the planned attacks succeeded. International health organizations were developing countermeasures based on analysis of the Phoenix outbreak, but the biological agents being prepared for the new attacks were more sophisticated and potentially more deadly. Rodriguez received intelligence reports indicating that 3 of the planned biological weapons attacks had been prevented through international intervention, but 9 facilities remained operational and were preparing to deploy bioweapons within hours. The conspiracy was still capable of killing millions of people, despite the exposure of their operations. Lisa discovered that the conspirators were also implementing final sterilization protocols designed to eliminate all evidence of the sustainability protocol. Facilities connected to the biological weapons program were being destroyed along with personnel who had detailed knowledge of the operations. They were willing to sacrifice their own people to prevent complete exposure of the conspiracy. "They're destroying everything," Lisa said desperately. "Research facilities, financial records, communication networks, even people who worked on the project. They're trying to erase all evidence that the sustainability protocol ever existed." I realized that our survival and escape from Phoenix had triggered a global catastrophe. The conspirators were implementing emergency protocols that would kill millions of people and destroy decades of evidence about their operations. By exposing the truth, we'd force them to accelerate their genocide program. But Dr. Chen reminded me that international intervention was also preventing far worse catastrophes. Without the evidence we'd recovered, the sustainability protocol would have continued for years, systematically eliminating billions of people through coordinated biological weapons attacks disguised as terrorist incidents or natural disasters. "You saved the world," Dr. Chen said quietly. "The sacrifice made by your group in Phoenix exposed a conspiracy that would have eliminated 90% of human population over the next decade. The cost has been terrible, but the alternative would have been infinitely worse." Rodriguez was monitoring military operations designed to prevent the remaining biological weapons attacks. International forces had located and secured 6 additional facilities, but 3 remained operational and were in the final stages of deploying bioweapons against target cities. The race against time was continuing. Lisa was working with international cybersecurity teams to disrupt communication networks that the conspirators were using to coordinate their final attacks. By preventing coordination between facilities, they might be able to reduce the effectiveness of any biological weapons that were successfully deployed. The news reports were showing emergency evacuations in target cities where biological weapons attacks were still possible. London, Tokyo, and Sydney were implementing unprecedented security protocols based on intelligence derived from our Phoenix evidence. Millions of people were being protected because of what we'd discovered during those 72 hours. But the cost of exposing the conspiracy was still mounting. International forces had prevented most of the planned attacks, but the biological weapons that had been successfully deployed were killing thousands of people in regions where countermeasures hadn't been implemented quickly enough. The truth had saved millions but couldn't save everyone. Rodriguez provided me with final intelligence reports about the status of international intervention operations. 12 biological weapons facilities had been secured or destroyed. Hundreds of government officials and corporate executives connected to the sustainability protocol had been arrested. Financial networks funding the conspiracy had been frozen or dismantled. Lisa showed me communication intercepts indicating that the remaining conspirators were implementing final elimination protocols. They were destroying all remaining evidence of their operations and eliminating anyone with detailed knowledge of the sustainability protocol. The conspiracy was collapsing, but they were trying to take as many secrets as possible to their graves. Dr. Chen explained that international investigators expected to spend years analyzing the evidence we'd recovered and tracking down all the connections revealed by our documentation. The Phoenix outbreak had been just one component of a conspiracy that involved thousands of people across dozens of countries and multiple decades of planning. The truth about Phoenix is spreading, Dr. Chen said. People are learning what their governments were planning to do to them. The sustainability protocol has been exposed, and the international community is implementing safeguards to prevent similar conspiracies from developing in the future. I realized that my role in exposing the conspiracy was complete, but the consequences would continue for years. The evidence we'd recovered would be used in international courts to prosecute crimes against humanity. The financial networks we'd traced would be investigated to identify additional conspirators. The technical specifications we'd documented would help develop countermeasures against biological weapons. Rodriguez was planning to continue working with international security agencies to hunt down remaining conspirators and prevent any attempts to restart the sustainability protocol. His military background and first-hand experience with the biological weapons made him valuable for ongoing investigations. Lisa was joining international cybersecurity teams that were tracking digital networks used by the conspiracy. Her technical skills and knowledge of the communication systems we'd discovered in Phoenix would help prevent similar plots from developing through online coordination. The survivors we'd worked with during the outbreak were being protected by international agencies while providing testimony about what they'd witnessed. Marcus, Pete, Sarah, and the others who'd escaped through different routes were all contributing evidence that supported our documentation of the conspiracy. Dr. Chen provided me with a secure communication device that would allow me to stay in contact with the international investigation as it continued. The evidence we'd recovered was still being analyzed, and additional questions might arise that required clarification from someone who'd been present during the original outbreak. But she also warned me that remaining conspirators would probably continue trying to eliminate witnesses to protect whatever secrets hadn't been exposed yet. The sustainability protocol had been disrupted, but the people who'd planned and funded it were still dangerous to anyone who could testify about their operations. I understood that my survival had come with permanent responsibilities. The evidence we'd recovered from Phoenix would be used to protect millions of people from biological weapons attacks, but it would also make me a target for anyone trying to restart similar operations in the future. The truth about Phoenix was spreading through international media despite American government attempts to suppress it. People around the world were learning that their own governments had been planning to eliminate them using biological weapons disguised as counterterrorism operations. The conspiracy we'd exposed was changing global politics and international relations. But most importantly, the sustainability protocol had been stopped before it could eliminate billions of people. The sacrifice made by everyone who died during the Phoenix outbreak had prevented a genocide that would have reduced human population by 90% over the next decade. I'm recording this message from a secure location outside the United States, where international agencies are still protecting witnesses from the Phoenix investigation. The evidence we recovered is being used to prosecute the largest criminal conspiracy in human history. And the truth about biological weapons testing on American civilians is finally being exposed. The people responsible for Project Lazarus and the sustainability protocol thought they could eliminate millions of innocent people and cover up their crimes through systematic destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses. They were wrong. The truth survived, and justice is coming for everyone involved in planning genocide against their own people. If you're watching this message, it means the evidence we died to protect has reached people who can use it to prevent similar atrocities. In the future, the conspiracy has been exposed, the biological weapons programs have been shut down, and the international community is working to ensure that governments can never again use systematic murder to control their populations. The 72 hours I survived in Phoenix changed everything, not just for the people who lived through the outbreak, but for everyone who might have become victims of biological weapons attacks in other cities around the world. Sometimes the most important victories are the disasters that never happen because someone was willing to fight for the truth.